Hey guys, tonight we're stepping softly into a meadow where the air smells faintly of damp grass, wood smoke, and just a hint of wildflowers. You hear the gentle hum of wings all around you, not threatening, not frantic, just steady, like nature's own lullaby. This is the world of medieval beekeepers, a quiet profession buzzing on the edges of villages, monasteries, and forests. And yes, you're about to spend hours with straw skeps, sticky honey, and songs that sound a bit like lullabies from not the babies but the bees. You probably wouldn't survive this workday between the stings, the taxes, and the endless chanting. It's not exactly glamorous, but it makes for a strangely soothing story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the medieval countryside just after dawn, your shoes soaked from dew, your cloak heavy with mist. The villagers are already awake. Someone is hammering at a cartwheel. Another person shouts at a stubborn cow. But a quieter sound draws you, low, steady humming from the edge of the fields. There, under the shelter of a hedgerow, a cluster of domed straw skeps sits on wooden stands, bees darting in and out like golden sparks. A monk in a patched brown robe hums along with them, his voice low, tuneless, and oddly comforting. This is your introduction to medieval beekeeping. Unlike today's neat white wooden hives with frames and tidy order, these straw skeps look like oversized baskets flipped upside down. They're nothing fancy, but they keep the bees contained and, most importantly, accessible for honey harvest. You crouch closer and the monk doesn't shoo you away. Instead, he nods, as though anyone curious about bees must first listen. Mainstream history tells you honey was essential. With sugar expensive and rare in Europe until later centuries, honey was a sweetener of daily life. It flavored food, preserved fruit, and healed wounds. Without it, your diet would feel blander, your medicine chest emptier, and your church darker, because beeswax candles lit the prayers of every monk and peasant. But here's a quirk you didn't expect. Medieval beekeepers didn't just watch their hives in silence. They sang to them. Some hummed chant from the Psalms. Others murmured little rhymes half-pagan, half-Christian. The idea wasn't only to calm the bees. It was to acknowledge them almost like family members. There was a belief that bees could sense joy and sorrow, that they were part of the household spirit. If someone in the family died, you were supposed to tell the bees, gently tapping on the hive and sharing the news. Otherwise, the bees might sulk or even fly away entirely. Historians still argue whether this custom was widespread ritual or just scattered folklore, but standing here you feel how natural it would be to sing. The bees seem to shift rhythm when the monk's voice deepens, and your own hum joins without thought. It's less a performance than a background drone, like when you hum in the shower just to fill the silence. The morning passes slowly. Bees wander in with legs caked in pollen, wobbling under the load. Others dart out like arrows toward unseen fields of flowers. You smell clover and hear the rustle of rye in the distance. It's not the kind of excitement that keeps you on the edge of your seat. More the kind that nudges your eyelids heavy. One mainstream fact. Monasteries across Europe kept bees as carefully as they kept sheep or cattle. Records show abbeys had whole sections of land devoted to hives, with wax profits funding not just daily bread but new cloisters. Bees weren't side hobbies. They were economic engines wrapped in wings. And yet, tucked within this buzzing commerce is a fringe tidbit. Some chroniclers claim that bees hum not because of their wings, but because they absorb sound from the universe itself, a kind of cosmic music vibrating through their tiny bodies. You laugh quietly, imagining medieval scholars craning their ears at insects like they were radio transmitters for heavenly choirs. The monk beside you adjusts his hood, still humming. You ask, though softly, why he sings. He shrugs, saying something about keeping the bees calm, but then he adds that they're companions in prayer. You nod, not because you fully understand, but because in this meadow with this sound, it somehow makes perfect sense. And so, as the sun creeps higher, you realize the first note of medieval beekeeping isn't the honey or the wax or even the sting. It's the song. Always the song. You linger by the hives as the sun climbs higher, noticing the way their domed shapes gleam in the light. They're not carved from wood or shaped from clay. These are straw skeps, woven with painstaking care, layered with cow dung or mud on top to help shed rain. They look humble, almost laughably so, like overturned baskets someone forgot put away. But here in the medieval meadow, they are the height of apicultural technology. You reach out and run your fingers along the rough straw. It scratches your skin, leaving a faint grassy smell on your hand. The monk notices but doesn't scold. He knows you'll pull back quickly enough when the bees tickle your knuckles, warning you to keep respectful distance. You watch the insects land and slip through a small gap at the bottom of the skep, wings catching the light in flashes of gold. Mainstream history tells us these skeps were the standard hive design for centuries in Europe. They worked, but they weren't convenient. To harvest honey, you usually had to destroy part of the hive, sometimes the entire colony. Imagine raising livestock only to butcher the whole herd just to taste a little sweetness. Yet people accepted it. Honey and wax were precious enough to justify the loss. The bees would swarm again next season, and with luck, a new colony would take their place. But here's a quirky little tidbit. Some beekeepers fashion miniature roofs of thatch or wooden shingles to cover their skeps, almost like doll-sized houses. You picture a line of beehives wearing tiny hats, sitting politely on benches like peasants at a church pew. It's hard not to smirk. Medieval life may have been harsh, but it also had a streak of whimsy. Historians still argue whether these decorative bee shelters were common across Europe or simply flourished in pockets of Germany and the Low Countries. Some sketches survive in manuscripts, but as with so many medieval things, the record is patchy, half fact, half daydream. The monk hums again, a low droning note that seems to blend with the buzzing wings. You notice how he stands, not over the hives, but beside them, like a neighbor chatting at a fence. He mutters in Latin, half prayer, half recipe, words slipping into the air like incense smoke. Bees rise and fall around him, unconcerned. You crouch and imagine the life of these keepers. Straw woven in long winter evenings, fingers raw from pulling reeds. A spring morning carrying the heavy skeps out to stands, lifting them carefully, muttering charms to keep swarms docile. By summer, the air is thick with honey scent, heavy enough to make you salivate. And by autumn, it's time to harvest, cutting combs, straining golden liquid through linen, and setting aside wax of the church. The hum of the field pulls you deeper. Each bee seems to follow a pattern, circling lazily before darting straight home. You think of how modern science tells us they use sun, magnetism, and even tiny dances to communicate directions. Medieval people didn't know this, but they sensed something uncanny. These were not dumb insects. They were organized, disciplined, almost military in their movements. You hear echoes of sermons comparing monks to bees, each working selflessly for the whole, each drone a servant to the greater hive. The monk leans down, lifts a corner of one skep, and you glimpse the inner world, a dark, humming chamber thick with wax and movement. It's mesmerizing, a living labyrinth. You pull back quickly, your heart beating fast, but also oddly calm, and then the fringe detail returns to your mind. There were medieval writers who insisted bees were born not from other bees, but from the carcasses of cattle. This belief, called begonia, had ancient roots. You grin, imagining a bewildered villager dragging a dead ox into a field, waiting patiently for the buzzing miracle. Did it work? Absolutely not. But the myth endured stubbornly, like a song stuck in your head. The monk doesn't mention begonia, but he might have believed it anyway. He strokes his beard, hums another note, and tilts his head as though listening not just to bees, but to something older, deeper, threaded into the straw walls of the hive. You settle back on the grass, the air warm now, your eyes heavy. Skeps line the field like sentinels. Each hum, each creak of straw, feels less like farming and more like an ancient symphony, messy, buzzing, but profoundly steady. You shift on the damp grass, still listening to the monk's humming voice as the bees sweep in and out of their straw homes. And then the smell reaches you, sweet, almost cloying, drifting from a small clay jar resting near his feet. Honey, not just a drizzle on toast you know today, but medieval honey, thick, raw, cloudy with pollen and wax. You dip a finger when a monk nods, and the taste hits your tongue, golden, almost floral, with an earthy tang that makes you think of soil, smoke, and sun all at once. Mainstream fact. Honey in the medieval world wasn't just food. It was medicine, and not in the casual tea with honey for a sore throat way. Doctors and apothecaries prescribed it for wounds, burns, ulcers, and even stomach troubles. Mixed with vinegar, it became oximal, a tonic for coughs and congestion. Combined with herbs, it was an early antibiotic. In monasteries, you'd find honey stored alongside healing salves, tucked carefully into jars sealed with wax. And here's the quirky tidbit. Medieval recipe books sometimes recommended honey for baldness. Yes, the instruction was to smear a concoction of honey, onions, and crushed bird droppings on your scalp and wait patiently for miracles. You wrinkle your nose and laugh softly, grateful that modern shampoo doesn't involve pigeons. Still, you can picture a desperate knight, helmet removed, dutifully rubbing this fragrant mess into his thinning hair, while servants tried not to gag. Historians still argue whether honey's reputation as a cure-all was exaggerated by scribes eager to record remedies, or whether its antibacterial qualities were genuinely noticed in daily practice. Evidence leans toward it really worked, but medieval medicine always mixed practical observation with mystical faith. After all, if bees were considered semi-sacred creatures, then their golden produce must have held divine healing. You wander in imagination to a medieval infirmary. The air is heavy with herbs drying from rafters, sage, rosemary, lavender. On a wooden table sits a wide bowl of honey, shimmering in the candlelight. A monk dips a cloth, presses it against a wounded soldier's arm. The soldier winces, but soon his breath eases. The pain dulls. You hear the scrape of quills as scribes record notes, though half their words are prayers rather than prescriptions. Your modern mind can't help but smile. Honey for wounds sounds soothing, sure, but you also know it works surprisingly well. Its acidity and lack of moisture make it hard for bacteria to thrive. Without microscopes, medieval healers still stumbled onto one of nature's most reliable antiseptics. And then you imagine the kitchen. Honey drizzle on bread, mixed with almonds, folded into spiced wine. It wasn't just medicine, it was luxury. Rich households kept jars locked away like treasure, while peasants only tasted it during festivals. When the monk beside you scoops a dollop and lets you try, it feels like a gift far richer than a coin. You glance again at the bees, their wings shimmering. You remember that odd folk belief, that bees hum the music of the spheres, carrying universal harmony in their tiny bodies. If honey was condensed sunlight, then maybe, just maybe, it carried harmony too. The monk wipes his sticky fingers on his robe, unbothered. He hums louder, this time shaping the sound into something almost like a lullaby. Bees weave around his face, but none sting him. You can't decide if it's practice, luck, or some secret pact between man and insect. Your thoughts drift to another detail. Honey was also used in embalming. Some chronicles claim that great kings or saints were preserved in honey jars, their bodies encased in sweetness until discovery years later. Whether true or exaggerated, it makes you laugh softly. Imagine explaining to future archaeologists, yes, our holy relic is marinated like candied fruit. The monk finally offers you a small cup. The liquid inside is diluted honey water, faintly fermented. It tastes sharp, medicinal, yet strangely refreshing. Your eyelids droop. The buzzing around you no longer sounds busy. It sounds like 1,000 tiny breaths, weaving together into one endless sigh. You wipe the last sticky traces of honey from your lips as your gaze follows the monk back toward the cloister. There, in the dimness of a stone chapel, beeswax makes its silent entrance. Candles line the altar, their flames wavering against the cold walls, casting long shadows over carved saints. The light is soft, golden, gentler than the smoky torches or oil lamps of the peasantry. You realize the bees outside aren't just feeding monks. They are lighting their prayers. Mainstream fact. Beeswax candles were prized in medieval Europe for their purity. Unlike tallow candles made from animal fat, which smoked and stank of kitchens or butcher stalls, beeswax burned clean and bright. They became symbols of holiness, illuminating cathedrals from Chartres to Canterbury. Monasteries sometimes manage entire beekeeping operations simply to keep the chapels glowing. Without bees, night vigils would have been far darker, and maybe even lonelier. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some towns, you could pay part of your taxes not in coins but in candles. Imagine trudging to the local lord with an armful of beeswax tapers, muttering apologies if one snapped on the way. Even stranger, some communities measure time by candles, the so-called candle clocks, where hours pass as wax dripped. You picture a monk dozing off during prayers, waking with a start when the flame sputters out halfway through the hour. Historians still argue whether peasants commonly access beeswax or if it remained almost entirely a luxury for churches and noble households. The written accounts tilt toward the wealthy, but archaeological finds suggest fragments of beeswax turned up in more modest homes too. Maybe villagers snuck small amounts from their skeps for Christmas Mass, saving the pure light for holy nights. The chapel hums with silence. You imagine each flame as it be transformed. Flight turned into fire, buzzing traded for glow. The air carries that faint, sweet perfume of warm wax, different from honey but still recognizable. You close your eyes and can almost feel the centuries of whispered prayers rising with that smoke, curling upward like invisible hymns. Then, of course, your modern brain provides a comic image. Imagine the poor acolyte assigned to trim hundreds of candles by hand, snipping blackened wicks in endless repetition. You sigh. No medieval innovation was glamorous for the assistants. Somewhere in the shadows, a boy scratches his head, thinking that perhaps sheep shearing might have been a better career path. You open your eyes again. The monk gestures at the flickering altar, humming softly. He's not only tending bees, he's tending light. You recall that in medieval symbolism, bees were considered virginal because people didn't yet understand reproduction in hives. The purity of their wax made it suitable for sacred rites. It's a strange loop. Mistaken biology gave rise to theology, which in turn shaped how countless candles were lit. As you sit in the pew, the world outside feels distant. The buzzing meadow has transformed into glowing stillness, the warmth of wax replacing the hum of wings. And yet, it's all connected. The skeps, the honey, the candles, the prayers. Without the bees, this chapel will be dark. The chants lonelier, the hours longer. You chuckle softly, remembering an odd medieval belief that beeswax could cure warts if rubbed directly on the skin. Picture a solemn villager sneaking a candle stub into his pocket, dabbing it furtively on his hand, while hoping nobody noticed. Faith and folk remedy merged seamlessly in those times. Sometimes the cure was genuine. Sometimes it was more about hope. The monk hums one last note. A candle sputters, and for a moment the flame flares high, bright enough to make you blink. The air grows warmer. You lean back against a wooden bench, lulled by the scent of wax and the faint crackle of fire. The bees may be outside, but their presence is still here, flickering in every shadow. You stretch your legs on the cold stone floor, still blinking from the golden light of beeswax candles, and follow the monk out into the open air again. Beyond the cloister walls, you notice something less holy but just as important. A ledger. A steward in a woolen cloak is tallying numbers, his quill scratching across parchment. His subject? Hives. Not prayers, not songs, taxes. Mainstream fact. In the medieval world, honey and wax weren't just luxuries. They were taxable resources. Lords demanded jars of honey or blocks of wax as rent from peasants who kept hives on their land. In some regions, entire manors calculated obligations not by sheep or cattle, but by the number of skeps lining a villager's yard. Bees were buzzing coin purses, and every drop of honey translated to wealth in kitchens, markets, or churches. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some lords were known to send tax collectors armed with smoke pots, forcing villagers to prove the number of active hives they owned by driving the bees out in front of witnesses. You imagine the absurd scene. Terrified peasants waving their arms, collectors coughing in smoke, and bees zigzagging angrily into the sky. It sounds less like orderly taxation, and more like an early medieval slapstick comedy routine. Historians still argue whether taxation on bees was harsher in northern Europe than in the Mediterranean. Evidence suggests southern monasteries may have spared peasants heavier burdens because vineyards and olives dominated there, while northern economies lean more heavily on bees for sweetness and light. The debate continues, buzzing quietly in academic journals, much like the hives themselves. The steward looks smug as he scratches down a number. You hear him mutter something about 10 skeps, 3 jars of honey, 2 blocks of wax. You can't help but imagine the frustration of a peasant who's just been stung 10 times, only to realize part of his harvest will never even sweeten his own bread. Taxes take the sting out of everything, quite literally here. Yet, oddly enough, this system also gave bees a strange protection. Since hives were valuable, stealing them was a serious offense. Law codes across Europe set hefty fines for damaging or robbing skeps. You picture 2 villagers in a muddy field shouting accusations. "You stole my swarm." No, it just flew to me of its own accord. The judge probably sighed, rubbed his temples, and fined them both for wasting his time. You wander a little further and find a small market square. Stalls displayed jars of honey alongside cloth pottery and dried fish. Children poke fingers into the sticky sweetness, earning sharp slaps from mothers. A merchant loudly boasts that his wax is pure as saintly light, though you suspect he watered the honey or stretched the wax with tallow. Markets ran on trust, gossip, and the occasional sting of dishonesty. You let yourself smile at the irony. Bees, creatures that worked tirelessly for their colony, became the source of disputes, taxes, and profits among humans who couldn't seem to cooperate nearly as well. Somewhere, a bee buzzes past your ear as if to remind you who the real masters of efficiency are. Another thought drifts in. Medieval people believed bees could sense injustice. Some tales claim that if a lord overtaxed, bees might abandon the land in protest. Whether this was wishful thinking or whispered peasant fantasy, you can almost imagine entire swarms rising in slow golden rebellion, leaving their skeps empty as an act of silent resistance. The monk at your side hums again, softer now, perhaps amused by your wandering thoughts. He doesn't seem bothered by taxes. Maybe the monastery sheriff protected by divine authority. He pats a skep gently, as though to reassure it. "Don't worry, little ones. We'll keep enough for ourselves." The sun drifts westward, lengthening shadows across the market and meadow alike. You realize that the medieval villagers, bees weren't just buzzing insects. They were units of economy, tied directly to survival, faith, and obligation. The hum of wings wasn't only natural, it was financial background noise. And yet, despite all the ledgers and lords, the bees keep working, unbothered by human squabbles. Their tiny bodies vanish into the fields, return heavy with pollen, and repeat endlessly, perfectly indifferent to who owns a jar or counts the wax. You exhale, amused at the thought. Bees might have been medieval Europe's most diligent taxpayers, never dodging, never hiding, just humming their golden tribute. The steward with his parchment disappears behind you, but the hum remains steady as ever. You walk back toward the meadow, where the monk has settled on a wooden stool. His lips move again, not in prayer this time, but in melody. A tune so simple, so repetitive, you almost mistake it for nothing more than idle humming. But he leans toward the hives as though expecting a response. This is the heart of it, the song sung for bees. Mainstream fact. Across medieval Europe, beekeepers believed that bees could be soothed, even guided, by human voices. Songs were used to calm swarms, to encourage colonies to stay, and to mark special occasions like weddings or funerals. The practice survived well into modern folklore. English traditions still speak of telling the bees, keeping them informed of household events through words or song. The belief was that bees, like neighbors, needed to feel included or they might sulk or abandon the hive. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, the songs were less like hymns and more like work chants, nonsense syllables strung together in soothing rhythm. Imagine a peasant standing ankle-deep in mud, chanting, "Humbier, humbier, little bees, don't fly away," while swatting at gnats with the other hand. It wasn't exactly poetic, but it worked well enough. Modern scientists would call it coincidence, but to medieval ears, a steady drone of songs seemed to blend with the hive's natural hum, creating harmony between man and insect. Historians still argue whether these be songs carried religious overtones everywhere, or whether they were mostly secular charms layered with superstition. Some manuscripts preserve Latin hymns adapted for bees, while oral tradition remembers earthy rhymes with no sacred intent. It's likely both coexisted. Monks murmuring psalms at their hives, peasants whistling nonsense melodies while hauling skeps across fields. You listen now as the monk croons a phrase in Latin, pausing every few breaths. The bees continue their work, weaving in and out of the skeps, their wings syncing almost unconsciously with his rhythm. The air feels thick, vibrating with a strange duet. You hum along under your breath, and for a moment it's impossible to tell which sound is yours and which is theirs. Your mind wanders to odd medieval instructions. Some beekeeping manuals advise that keepers strike pots or ring bells when a swarm appeared, the noise supposedly encouraging bees to settle. Picture a village exploding into impromptu percussion whenever a cloud of insects took flight. Every housewife banging pans in the hope of coaxing them down. The effect must have been chaotic, but also strangely festive, like a street parade led by buzzing confetti. The monk's song slows, softer now, like a lullaby winding down. Bees circle lazily above, their patterns no longer frantic. You feel the weight of the moment. How fragile, how strange, that humans believe their voices mattered to these tiny creatures. And maybe, just maybe, they did. The vibrations of song could have calmed the beekeeper as much as the bees, keeping movement slow and steady instead of panicked. A bee brushes your cheek, light as a whisper. You don't flinch. The monk smiles faintly, as though the insect approved of your participation. You wonder how many generations hummed these same notes, never writing them down, trusting the rhythm of voice to pass from elder to child. One more stray thought makes you grin. Some stories claim bees had a taste for music itself, that fiddlers could play them calmer, that flute tunes charmed them back into skeps. You imagine a medieval minstrel negotiating performance, fees not for nobles, but for hives. 2 songs for the bees, 1 for the bride and groom. As the melody fades, the meadow grows quiet again. The bees hum, but it's steady now, like a low chorus tucked into grass. You realize that the song wasn't about controlling them. It was about joining them. A reminder that in this buzzing partnership, humans were never fully in charge. You lean back and grasp, smiling softly at the absurdity and beauty of it. Bees didn't need your voice, but you needed theirs, and the song was how you pretended to belong. The meadow grows quiet after the song, but you feel another current beneath it, older and stranger than Latin hymns. The monk doesn't say much, only hums, yet the rhythm reminds you of something pre-Christian, a tune that might once have been sung by farmers long before the church bell rang over these fields. You tilt your head and wonder, how many of these bee rituals were really older than the monks themselves? Mainstream fact, beekeeping in Europe predates Christianity by centuries. The Greeks and Romans wrote about hives, honey, and the strange habits of bees. Druids in Celtic lands, too, were said to have used honey in sacred rites. When Christianity spread, it didn't erase these customs. It folded them in, wrapping pagan charms with saintly language. So, the songs you hear in the meadow may sound Christian now, but their bones are far older. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some villages, people offer the first spoonful of honey to the household spirits, setting it on a threshold or burying it near the garden. Others whisper to bees in riddles, believing the insects enjoyed puzzles. Imagine kneeling by a hive and reciting a nonsense riddle like, "What runs but has no legs?" only to be met with polite buzzing silence. You chuckle to yourself. It's a medieval version of stand-up comedy with an audience that never clapped. Historians still argue whether these pagan remnants were tolerated by the church or simply went unnoticed because they look harmless. Some clergy wrote sternly against heathen songs sung to hives, but others shrugged and even copied the melodies into Latin psalters. Was it syncretism or oversight? The debate hums on like bees in a hedge. The monk rises, adjusts his hood, and leads you past a small wooden cross planted near the hives. It's simple, weathered, not much more than 2 sticks tied together. He murmurs a blessing over the bees, but the gesture feels layered, part prayer, part charm, as though hedging bets between heaven and earth. You sense he knows the old songs too, but would never admit it outright. You crouch again beside the skeps and picture older times. Women circling hives with garlands of herbs, men pouring honey into shallow bowls for unseen gods. smoke curling from fires, chants rising under the night sky, the bees drowsing in their baskets, but somehow included in the ceremony. The rhythm of it feels eternal, as though bees have always been intermediaries between people and mystery. A playful thought interrupts. Imagine bees as picky critics of human devotion, flapping their wings disapprovingly at off-key singers, or buzzing happily at the best chanters. If anyone dare forget them, perhaps they'd express disappointment by stinging an unlucky shepherd or abandoning a skep altogether. You lean back, eyes half closed, and feel how fragile the boundary was between religion and folklore. One moment, a monk chanting psalms. The next, a villager humming a half-remembered pagan tune. Both aim for the same outcome. Peaceful hives, steady honey, a feeling of connection to something larger. The breeze picks up, carrying the scent of time from a nearby patch of earth. Bees swoop over it eagerly, landing, disappearing, then rising again, heavy with pollen. You think, they don't care whether the tune is pagan or Christian. They answer only to the sun, the flowers, the hive. Yet humans, ever restless, stitch them into every story we told. Stories about gods, about souls, about harmony. The monk pauses and hums again, softer this time, like a secret folded into the wind. You close your eyes and imagine voices from centuries before him humming the same way, layered through time like echoes in a valley. The bees never asked for it, but perhaps, just perhaps, they listened. Oh, you sit in the grass, lulled by the mingling of chants and buzzing, when the monk chuckles softly. He scratches his beard and mutters about bee kings. That jolts your thoughts, because today you know queens rule the hive, but medieval people had other ideas entirely. Mainstream fact. Throughout much of the Middle Ages, naturalists and scholars insisted that the leader of a hive was male, a king bee. The Latin texts of writers like Virgil described monarchs of hives as kings, and medieval readers took it at face value. The idea of a queen directing thousands of workers didn't take firm hold until early modern science corrected the error. Until then, bees marched behind a king. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts even illustrated the so-called bee king wearing a crown. Imagine a solemn, tiny insect sitting on a throne, miniature scepter in hand, bossing around thousands of subjects. You grin. It's ridiculous, but also oddly charming, like a medieval political cartoon. And yet, those drawings were serious attempts to map insect society to human hierarchy. Historians still argue whether beekeepers themselves knew better from observation. After all, anyone who split skeps or watched hives closely might have noticed one large be surrounded by attendants, clearly female. But perhaps they didn't say it aloud, or their insights were dismissed by scholars preferring the comfort of kingly metaphors. The clash between lived practice and bookish authority lingers in debate. The monk gestures at a hive, murmuring, "Our Lord within." He doesn't mean God. He means the supposed be king. You tilt your head, biting back a smile. The metaphor fits medieval society perfectly. A king ruling loyal workers, order maintained through obedience. The hive became a mirror for politics, a buzzing sermon on why peasants should serve and nobles should reign. And yet, you feel the irony pressing in. The true ruler is a queen, tirelessly laying eggs, surrounded by attendants. A mother, not a father, drives the hive's survival. You almost want to whisper it to the monk, but you know he'd shake his head, convinced his books and sermons outweigh your observations. A bee lands on your sleeve, larger than the others. You wonder, could it be a queen or just a hefty drone? The monk doesn't notice. Still humming. You watch the insect's calm dignity, and for a moment, it feels like she knows the truth of her own power, even if the humans don't. You let your mind drift to those endless sermons where priests compare the hive to a kingdom. Workers as peasants, drones as idle nobles, and the king bee as sovereign. Some even suggested bees never strayed far from their monarch. Proof of loyalty. In reality, it was biology, not politics. But medieval people loved to bend nature into metaphors for their own order. Your humor sparks again. If bees had known they were being compared to kings, they might have rolled their tiny compound eyes. And queens, hidden deep in a hive, might have chuckled at being misgendered for centuries. The monk closes his eyes, still murmuring about loyalty and kingship. You lean back, realizing how human need for hierarchy shaped even the way we described insects. And you wonder, was a hum of the bees laughter at our arrogance, or just the endless, indifferent chorus of nature doing its work? The meadow quiets around you, the song fading into low buzz. You smile, knowing the truth. The hive was always ruled by a queen. But for the medieval mind, kings were everywhere, even where they didn't belong. You shift your weight on the grass, still chuckling at the notion of a crown be king, when the monk suddenly pulls a slim, leather-bound book from his satchel. He opens it with surprising care, as though even the bees should hush and listen. You peer over his shoulder and see the cramped handwriting of Latin, dark ink faded at the edges, filled with diagrams that look half scientific, half dreamlike. Mainstream fact. Medieval Europe produced a number of beekeeping manuals, some copied from classical sources like Aristotle, others written by monks compiling generations of observation. These texts blended careful notes on hive management with superstition, prescribing when to split skeps, how to harvest honey, and which herbs soothed swarms. They were part farm guide, part spiritual handbook, and part medical recipe book. The quirky tidbit: some manuals recommended smearing hives with cow dung mixed with ash to invite prosperity. Others advised that if bees grew sluggish, you should sprinkle them with holy water, preferably blessed on Easter Sunday, for renewed energy. You imagine a weary beekeeper on a hot afternoon, tossing handfuls of cow dung, and then carefully sprinkling droplets of sacred water, wondering which ingredient really made the difference. Historians still argue whether these manuals were widely circulated among peasants or mainly hoarded in monasteries. Literacy was rare. After all, most villagers likely relied on oral tradition, rhymes, and apprenticeship. The texts we still have today might represent the monastic side of the craft, tidy, methodical, and deeply theological. Out in the fields, though, the songs and rituals had a rougher, earthier flavor. The monk turns a page and you spot a strange diagram. A hive drawn as a castle with turrets, bees buzzing like knights around its walls. The metaphor is clear. The hive as fortress, the insects as defenders. You can't help but grin. Medieval scribes seemed unable to resist turning bees into tiny citizens of a kingdom. Even their sketches blurred fact and fantasy. He points to a recipe written in neat script. Honey mixed with vinegar and garlic, recommended for coughs. You picture some poor villager sipping it, eyes watering, convincing themselves that relief must follow. And perhaps it did. You lick your lips unconsciously, remembering the jar you tasted earlier. The pages smell faintly of wax, as though the book has sat near hives too long. Your imagination wanders. Perhaps the scribe paused mid-sentence to shoo away a bee, leaving a tiny smudge where ink met wing. Centuries later, you're peering at that same smear, sharing a moment across time with a distracted beekeeper scribe. You smile again at the absurdity tucked in these pages. One note claims bees could be lured with the sound of clashing cymbals. You imagine a monk dragging percussion instruments into a meadow, banging them enthusiastically, while the bees ignore him completely. It feels like slapstick comedy, disguised as serious scholarship. The monk closes the book, his fingers sticky with wax and ink stains. He hums, as though reminding himself that no amount of Latin will ever match the sound of bees themselves. You realize that these manuals, precious as they are, never fully captured the living hum. They tried to pin buzzing chaos onto parchment, to box mystery into neat recipes. But the meadow reminds you, knowledge was always buzzing beyond the page. Your eyes grow heavy as the monk tucks the book away. The bees keep humming. Indifferent to their scholarly fame, their little wings droning louder than ink or parchment ever could. The leather-bound book disappears back into the monk's satchel, but he gestures for you to follow. You wander through a narrow archway into a cloister garden, where the air smells of rosemary, sage, and damp stone. Here, the hum of bees doesn't come only from skeps, but from the air itself, as they hover over herb beds, darting from violet blossoms to pale mint flowers. Monastic gardens weren't just quiet sanctuaries. They were laboratories of prayer and practicality. Mainstream fact. Many monasteries in medieval Europe kept bees as part of their self-sufficiency. The gardens provided herbs for medicine, food for the kitchen, and nectar for the hives. Beeswax lit their chapels, honey sweetened their ale, and the buzzing workers tied the monks' daily rhythm to the seasons. Some abbeys even employed dedicated apiarists, brothers whose sole task was to tend the skeps, harvest wax, and ensure the candles never ran short. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some monasteries, bees were thought to embody the virtues monks aspired to. They were chaste, communal, and industrious. Monks copied their example in sermons, and sometimes in less flattering comparisons. There's a story of one abbot scolding lazy brothers by saying, "Even the bees work harder than you." You picture a weary novice blushing as a bee buzzes smugly past his ear, as if agreeing with the abbot. Historians still argue whether the association between bees and monastic life was a matter of convenience, since monks needed wax for their candles, or whether there was a deeper, symbolic link. Did monks truly believe bees lived as tiny monks in miniature hives? Or did they simply appreciate the metaphor because it made sermons easier to write? The truth may lie somewhere in the buzz between symbolism and necessity. You stroll the cloister path, bare feet cool against flagstones. Bees hum around your head, but they're too busy with blossoms to sting. The monk bends to pluck a sprig of thyme, crushing it gently to release its sharp perfume. He mutters about how bees love it, then tucks it behind a hive like an offering. You watch, fascinated by the mix of observation and ritual. In one corner of the garden stand a row of skeps, shaded under a simple wooden roof. They look oddly at home among the herbs and stone arches, like living relics as sacred as the carved saints nearby. You imagine evenings here, monks chanting vespers while bees hum in counterpoint, two choirs weaving sound into one long drone. Your thoughts wander again to the sillier side. Imagine a monk late for prayer because he was too busy singing to bees, or worse, stung on the nose and arriving in chapel red-faced, trying to chant through the swelling. The solemn dignity of the cloister doesn't quite erase the comedy of swollen lips or buzzing interruptions. Yet, standing here, you sense the serenity that must have made this work bearable. The bees gave sweetness, light, and metaphors, but they also gave rhythm. Tending them meant mornings in sunlight, afternoons in hum, evenings with wax and honey. Life buzzed with purpose. The monk resumes his humming, softer than before, his voice blending with the bees and the wind through rosemary. You lean against a stone wall, eyes closing. The cloister feels timeless, half garden, half hive, a place where human prayer and insect labor blurred into one. The cloister fade behind you, but the scent of herbs still clings to your cloak. You follow the monk into a larger courtyard where the air is richer, heavier, almost intoxicating. From an open kitchen door drifts the smell of hearth smoke and simmering pots. Bees may have been praised in sermons and tax ledgers, but here their gift finds its most delicious destiny: food. Mainstream fact: honey was a central ingredient in medieval kitchens, both noble and humble. It sweetened sauces, preserved fruit, and glazed roasted meats, long before sugar became affordable in Europe. Honey was the everyday sweetener, found in everything from humble porridge to lavish feasts. In many recipes, it wasn't just about sweetness. It added texture, stickiness, and even acted as a preservative. Here's the quirky tidbit. Medieval cooks sometimes used honey as a glaze on fish. Imagine a roasted carp, gleaming golden under candlelight, its skin sticky with sweetness. The contrast sounds odd to modern tastes, but back then, savory and sweet often mingled freely. You chuckle at the thought of a dinner guest politely nodding, while secretly wondering why dessert had arrived with scales. Historians still argue whether honey was more common in peasant kitchens or restricted to monasteries and manors. Records suggest peasants used it sparingly, perhaps saving it for feast days, while monasteries and noble households consumed it in bulk. Archaeological evidence of honey jars in humble cottages, though, hints at wider access than the texts admit. Perhaps villagers enjoyed honey more often than chroniclers assumed, licking it from wooden spoons with guilty pleasure. You step into the kitchen, and your senses are overwhelmed. On one table sits a pot of barley porridge, steaming, ready to be drizzled with honey. Beside it, a jug of mead glints amber in the firelight. A cook in rolled-up sleeves pours honey into a mortar, grinding it with herbs to make a sauce for tonight's meal. His hands are sticky, and he curses softly when Bee sneaks in, drawn to the sweetness. You laugh under your breath. It's a scene that hasn't changed in centuries. Bees intrude where honey sits, stubbornly reclaiming their treasure. The cook swats half-heartedly, muttering about thieving insects while spooning more into his pot. You sample a spoonful of warm bread dipped in honey. It's coarse, whole grain, the crust smoky from the oven. The honey drips down your chin, and you realize why it was so treasured. One taste transforms the simplest food into luxury. No wonder peasants dreamed of it, and nobles flaunted it. A jug of mead catches your eye. The cook waves you closer, sloshing golden liquid into a wooden cup. It tastes sharp and sweet, fizzing faintly as it slides down. Mead was more than drink. It was ritual, celebration, an excuse for laughter in dreary seasons. Festivals often ended with slurred songs, mugs clinking, and sticky floors. You imagine medieval weddings, brides and grooms toasted with honeyed wine, their union blessed by bees as much as by priests. Your mind drifts to the sillier side again. Some recipes advise boiling honey into hard candies. But medieval dentistry wasn't exactly advanced. You picture a noble gnawing proudly on honey candy, only to yelp when half a tooth comes loose. Sweetness always came with a price. The cook shouts for more firewood, and sparks leap into the air. Bees still hover near the doorway, drawn to their stolen treasure simmering in pots. You realize that every drop of honey meant not just survival, but joy. In a world of salted meat and bland grains, honey was delight itself. The monk comes again at your side, perhaps amused at the chaos. You take another sip of mead, feel its warm spread, and let the hum of the bees in the doorway blur into the crackle of the fire. Food, faith, and buzzing wings, all tangled in the same golden thread. The kitchen heat clings to your cloak as you step back into the cooler air of the cloister. The monk doesn't lead you outside this time. He guides you instead toward the scriptorium, that hushed chamber where monks bend over desks, quills scratching parchment. Here, bees leave their buzzing fields behind, but still find their way into the very pages of books. Mainstream fact: beeswax was a key tool for medieval manuscripts. It smoothed parchment, making rough animal skin easier to write on. Scribes rubbed thin layers across pages, preparing them for ink. Beeswax was also used to polish finished surfaces, seal pigments, and even mend damaged parchment. Without bees, the sacred and scholarly words of Europe might have remained much rougher to the touch, harder to preserve. Here's the quirky tidbit. Sometimes monks mix wax with chalk to create an erasable writing surface. Picture a medieval whiteboard, where students scribble practice letters and then scrape them off to start again. You grin at the image. A young novice doodling knights or rude caricatures in wax, quickly erasing them when a master approached. Proof that even in silent scriptoria, boredom buzzed like bees. Historians still argue whether beeswax was primarily valued for writing, or whether its candle-making role far outweighed the literary use. Surviving manuscripts bear wax traces, but the records lean heavily toward liturgical candles. Perhaps the scriptorium's wax was simply a convenient byproduct of the larger candle economy. The truth, like so much in medieval history, hovers in the margins. You watch a scribe at his desk, his face bent close to a page. He rubs a cloth across the parchment, the wax catching faint candlelight and leaving the surface smoother, shinier. His quill scratches faintly, letters curling across the page like vines. Every stroke is slower, steadier, thanks to the bees' unseen labor. The room smells of ink, musty parchment, and faint honeyed wax. It's soothing, almost hypnotic, as though the buzzing meadow has been translated into silence and script. The bees outside hum. The quills here scratch, both steady, both tireless. Another thought drifts in, absurd but funny. Imagine a swarm of bees loose in scriptorium, knocking over inkwells, landing in the drying pages, leaving smudges shaped like wings. Chaos would reign in a place built on silence. And yet, in a way, their presence already lives in every page. Each manuscript owes something to hives outside. The monk points to a shelf lined with codices. Their covers gleam faintly, polished with beeswax. He whispers something about preservation, how wax kept leather supple and water-resistant. You run your fingers across a binding. It feels smooth, almost alive, like the ghosts of the bees that made it. You picture the cycle clearly now. Bees buzz in meadows, monks hum in gardens, honey sweetens kitchens, wax lights chapels, and here, quiet, patient. The same wax makes parchment whisper. Every book becomes an echo of buzzing wings. The scribe looks up briefly, meeting your gaze with tired eyes. He dips his quill, scratches another line, and hums under his breath without realizing it. Not a hymn, not a chant. Just the same low droning rhythm that you've carried from meadow to chapel to kitchen. A song for bees, even here among the books. You exhale, settling into the rhythm, eyes tracing letters curling on the page. Outside, bees fly endlessly. Inside, monks write endlessly. Both labors weave permanence out of fragile materials. Wax, parchment, wings, ink. You close your eyes, and the scratch of the quill sounds almost like buzzing. The hush of the scriptorium follows you as you step into a stone hall, where voices echo more loudly, bouncing off vaulted ceilings. A monk in a heavy cloak mounts the pulpit, unrolling parchment, and begins to preach. You slide into a bench, beeswax still clinging faintly to your fingertips, and realize the sermon isn't about sin or saints today. It's about bees. Mainstream fact. Bees appeared often in medieval sermons as metaphors for human society and divine order. Priests compared their hives to the church, each bee working tirelessly like a good Christian, the drones as idol sinners, and the supposed king as Christ guiding the faithful. The metaphor reinforced discipline, hierarchy, and obedience, virtues essential to both hive and parish. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some sermons went so far as to warn parishioners not to be like drones, describing them as lazy freeloaders who fed off others' labor. The preacher here nearly spits the word drone, making you imagine half the congregation nervously glancing at their dozing neighbors. You smirk, picturing a poor farmer nudging his snoring friend awake just in time to hear, "Do not be like the drones." Historians still argue whether these sermons were inspired by genuine observation of bees or simply recycled from classical texts like Virgil and Aristotle. Some monks clearly watched hives closely. Others likely copied older allegories without caring much for accuracy. Either way, bees buzz their way into pulpits, metaphors folded neatly into theology. The monk raises his voice, describing the harmony of the hive as proof of divine design. He stretches out his arms, imitating bees fly in unison, his sleeves swishing like wings. Children in the pews giggle. An old woman shushes them. You can't help but chuckle quietly, too. There's something endearing about a solemn preacher flapping his arms like an oversized insect. And then the solemn note returns. He speaks of loyalty, of order, of how each bee sacrifices itself for the good of the hive. His voice softens. So, too must you, children of God, labor in harmony, singing as the bees do. You close your eyes, and the droning cadence nearly puts you to sleep. Your thoughts drift. Imagine sermons where metaphors piled up endlessly. Bees as Christians, wax as purity, honey as virtue. Somewhere, a villager must have sighed, thinking, I just wanted to eat honey, not become a honey metaphor. But the symbolism stuck. You open your eyes and notice carvings on a wooden pulpit. Tiny bees etched into the edges, their wings spread, bodies arranged in neat patterns. The preacher traces them unconsciously as he speaks, perhaps reminding himself of the buzzing meadow outside. Another odd belief crosses your mind. Some clergy insisted bees were born from paradise itself, creatures untainted by sin. Others thought they reproduced without sex, remaining perpetually virginal. You raise an eyebrow. If only they knew. Still, the metaphor was convenient. Bees as pure, industrious, holy, perfect sermon material. The monk's voice lowers to a hum, almost like the chants outside in the meadow. He closes the scroll, raises his hands in blessing, and the congregation murmurs a final prayer. As people shuffle out, you stay seated, amused and comforted by the thought that even in their most sacred spaces, medieval Christians couldn't resist weaving the story of bees into their search for order and meaning. The candles flicker. The air hums faintly. You sigh, feeling the metaphor settle over you too. Steady, sweet, a little sticky with symbolism. The sermon still echoes faintly in your ears as you wander from the church hall into the manor's great hall, a space that feels almost alien after the quiet of cloisters. Here the air is thick with roasting meat, spice wine, and chatter. Long wooden tables stretch beneath beams blackened by smoke. At the head, nobles recline in fur-trimmed robes, goblets in hand. And there, gleaming across the tables, lies honey, dripping, glistening, sticky in a way that feels both decadent and slightly absurd. Mainstream fact, at royal banquets and noble feasts, honey was everywhere. It coated roasted swans, glazed boars, flavored sauces, and dripped into spice wines. Without sugar imports, honey was a prestige sweetener, showing off wealth as much as taste. Chroniclers describe entire courses glittering with golden glaze, as if the meal itself had been dipped in sunlight. Here's the quirky tidbit. Honey was sometimes sculpted into edible table decorations. Imagine beeswax and honey molded into shapes of animals or castles, presented proudly before being smashed apart for dessert. The effect must have been equal parts impressive and messy. Guests licking sticky fingers, servants scrubbing long tables with buckets of water, floors tacky underfoot. You grin at the thought of a nobleman's dignity crumbling when honey dripped down his beard. Historians still argue whether peasants ever glimpsed these lavish honey-drenched meals, or if they only heard rumors. Manuscripts describe noble feasts in rich detail, but common folk may have only dreamed of such abundance while saving their small spoonfuls of honey for feast days. The divide between sticky-fingered nobles and sticky-fingered peasants was wide, but everyone understood honey as a marker of joy and status. The hall grows louder as servants parade platters down the aisle. A roasted peacock arrives, feathers reattached to its body for show, its skin glistening with honey glaze. Children gasp, minstrels strum lutes and pipes. Someone raises a goblet of mead, spilling golden drops onto the rush-strewn floor. A dog licks eagerly at the spill, earning a kick for his trouble. You sip from a goblet, pass your way. The mead is sweet, fizzy, sharp enough to warm your cheeks. You catch yourself humming, almost unconsciously, as the buzz of conversation rises like another hive. The metaphor strikes again, banquets and bee colonies both loud, crowded, hierarchical. Only here, the queen is a lady at the head table, pearls in her hair, smiling faintly as honey cakes are served. Then, a comic moment. One knight tries to scoop honey with a dagger, only for it to drip onto his lap. He curses, fumbles, and pretends nothing happened, though everyone nearby smirks. Sticky accidents at high tables remind you that medieval grandeur often hid behind very human clumsiness. A servant sets down a plate near you. Almond pastries drenched in honey, golden and warm. You bite one and the sweetness overwhelms, sticking to your teeth, clinging to your fingers. You imagine guests discreetly wiping hands on tunics when no one looked. For all the pomp, honey is impossible to control. It insists on spreading, smearing, dripping. Perhaps that was part of its magic. The minstrel strums louder, singing a ballad that likens noble valor to bees defending their hive. You laugh quietly. Yet another metaphor woven into the feast. From meadow to church to kitchen hall, bees seem to buzz everywhere, uninvited but impossible to ignore. You lean back, cup in hand, eyes heavy from sweetness and warmth. Around you, nobles boast, servants scurry, dogs beg, and honey glistens across every dish. For a moment, you wonder. Perhaps the bees themselves would have been amused, seeing their labor spread across velvet tables, dripping from golden goblets, celebrated as if it were the very essence of luxury. The feasting hall lingers in your senses, sticky fingers, golden glazes, meat humming in your veins, but the monk tugs you gently away. You step into cooler air where villagers gather in a muddy square, pointing upward at the sky. The mood is not festive. A cloud of bees swirls overhead, dark and restless, casting flickering shadows across the ground. People murmur uneasily, crossing themselves, muttering charms. For medieval folk, a swarm was never just insects. It was an omen. Mainstream fact. Swarming was a natural part of the bee life cycle. Colonies grew too large, and a portion of bees departed with their queen to find new shelter. But to medieval eyes, such sudden, dramatic movement looked like a sign. Chronicles mention swarms interpreted as warnings of war, famine, or even death. Villagers watched the sky anxiously, believing the bees carried messages from the divine. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some believe swarms could predict marriage. If bees settled on a maiden's roof, whispers began that she would wed soon. You picture embarrassed young women shooing neighbors away from their doors, muttering, "They're just bees," while friends giggled knowingly. The insects had no idea they were matchmaking. Historians still argue whether these omen beliefs were widespread truths or scattered superstitions. Written sources lean heavily on dramatic accounts. Monks loved recording portents. But folklore collected later suggests people mostly feared swarms for practical reasons. Stings lost honey, ruined skeps. The symbolic layer might have been added by clerics and chroniclers hungry for metaphors. The villagers in front of you react with a mix of fear and ritual. One man claps loudly, banging 2 pots together, hoping to drive the swarm down. Another woman sings softly, coaxing the bees toward her empty skep. The monk at your side hums again, low and steady, as though to remind them that sound calms more than frightens. You tilt your head back, watching the swarm twist like smoke against the sky. It's mesmerizing, hypnotic, a black cloud alive with motion. The villagers whisper, a sign perhaps the Lord will raise taxes again, or maybe sickness will come. You grin despite the tension, thinking that bees, unknowingly, were blamed for everything from politics to plague. Then a comic image slips into your mind. Imagine a poor farmer interpreting every random insect as prophecy. A wasp lands on his window. Ah, doom! A butterfly flits by. Marriage within a fortnight. If bees could laugh, perhaps they would at how much weight humans piled onto their wings. The swarm finally drifts downward, clustering around a low branch of an oak tree. The villagers breathe sighs of relief. The woman with the empty skep places it beneath the branch, still singing her charm. With gentle shakes, she coaxes the cluster into the basket. Applause ripples through the crowd. It feels less like beekeeping and more like capturing lightning in a jar. The monk smiles faintly. Not an omen today, he murmurs. Just new life. His voice is calm, but you sense he's seen swarms spark panic before. For people whose lives depended on harvests, every unusual sight was loaded with meaning. Bees, with their strange order and sudden movements, made perfect messengers for human anxieties. You watch the cluster settle into its new home, the hum softening. The villagers disperse, some still muttering about signs, others simply relieved no one was stung. The sky clears, the moment passes, but the impression lingers. Bees weren't just creatures of honey and wax. They were omens in flight, shadows across medieval imaginations. You take a breath, eyelids heavy, ears filled again with steady buzzing. The meadow, the chapel, the market, the hall, all had carried bees into daily life. But here, in the square, you see how easily wings became warnings. The oak tree stands quiet now, its branch lighter without the heavy swarm. The villagers shuffle back to their chores, but you notice that not everyone leaves the hives unguarded. A few men linger, carving simple marks into wooden posts near the skeps, whispering words you can't quite catch. The monk sighs, half tolerant, half amused, and explains that these are charms, protective symbols meant to shield the bees from harm. Mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, beekeepers often turned to charms, carvings, and whisper rhymes to protect their hives. Some carved crosses on the skeps, others tied ribbons or hung herbs like mint and rosemary nearby. Bees were too precious to leave to chance, and spiritual insurance felt as necessary as smoke pots or veils. Here's the quirky tidbit. One recorded charm advised beekeepers to speak directly into the hive, promising, "Stay with me, and you'll have bread and ale." You chuckle at the idea of a beekeeper bargaining with insects as though they were drinking companions. Imagine a medieval man leaning close, whispering promises of ale to bees who only crave nectar. Historians still argue whether these charms had genuine religious sanction or if they were tolerated as folk superstition. Some clergy condemned them as pagan remnants, while others shrugged, reasoning that God surely didn't mind a few whisper rhymes if they kept bees healthy. The debate hums quietly, like bees themselves, half faith, half pragmatism. The monk gestures at one skep, where a villager has tucked sprigs of rosemary into the straw. The scent is sharp, almost medicinal, and bees hover near it, perhaps intrigued. You wonder, Was it the charm, the herb's insect-repelling qualities, or simply coincidence when hives thrived afterward? For medieval minds, such distinctions hardly mattered. Results were results. You crouched beside another skep, tracing the carved cross on its side. The grooves are shallow but deliberate, a silent reminder that even insects were folded into Christian rituals. Some keepers even carried hives to the churchyard to be blessed, believing consecrated bees would swarm less and yield more honey. You picture the spectacle. Villagers marching into a chapel with buzzing baskets, bees zigzagging between pews, priests raising eyebrows but sprinkling holy water anyway. Your thoughts wander to the sillier possibilities. What if bees actually did respond to blessings, clustering politely when sprinkled, bowing their tiny heads at the sound of Latin chants? You smirk at the mental image of pious bees humming hymns alongside monks. The villager nearby whispers his rhyme again, something about protection from thieves and storms. He pats the skep gently, as though reassuring a pet. You feel the tenderness in the gesture. It isn't just superstition. It's care born of dependence. Without these bees, his winter might be darker, his meals plainer, his candles fewer. The charm is as much for himself as for them. The monk hums a psalm, quieter this time, letting the villager's rhymes blend with his chant. The sounds overlap, half Christian, half folk, both aimed at the same buzzing creatures. The bees don't seem to mind. They hover, they hum, they slip into their straw homes, indifferent to the rituals woven around them. And yet, you sense that the rituals mattered. They gave humans comfort, a sense of control over nature's wild rhythms. Even if the bees never listened, the songs and charms steadied trembling hands, soothed anxious hearts, and turned farming into something sacred. The sun sinks lower, and shadows lengthen over the skeps. You close your eyes, breathing in rosemary, listen to chants and rhymes fading into the drone of wings. The protective marks glow faintly in the dim light, as if promising safety through the night. The evening air cools quickly, and the hum around the hives softens as bees drift home. The monk gestures for you to follow, and you find yourself stepping into a dim barn at the edge of the village. The smell hits you first. Hay, damp wood, and faint sweetness from honeycombs tucked inside. You realize you're watching a practice few outsiders ever see, preparing hives for winter. Mainstream fact. Medieval beekeepers often shelter their skeps indoors during the cold months. Without insulated wooden hives, straw skeps offered little protection from freezing winds. So, keepers moved them into barns, cellars, or sheds, wrapping them in cloth or stuffing them with moss to help colonies survive. Wintering bees wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary to keep the hives alive until spring. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some villagers supposedly whispered lullabies to their bees as they carried them inside, urging them to sleep well until the flowers returned. Imagine trudging through snow, arms full of buzzing baskets, muttering, "Rest now, my little singers," while trying not to trip. It sounds absurd, but to a people who saw bees as household companions, the gesture made perfect sense. Historians still argue whether winter losses were catastrophic every year, or whether skill keepers regularly maintained colonies through cold seasons. Records note both disasters, entire apiaries wiped out by frost, and successes, with monks boasting of thriving hives. Perhaps survival depended less on rituals and more on luck with weather. The debate lingers, buzzing faintly like bees behind barn walls. You crouch inside the barn now, watching as skeps are stacked on wooden shelves, each one tilted slightly so condensation won't drown the bees inside. The monk hums, as always, while stuffing cracks with rags and straw. The air is chilly, but the sound comforts you, a reminder that care is constant, season to season. The bees themselves are quieter, clustered deep inside their combs. You lean close and hear only a faint, steady vibration, like a heartbeat hidden in straw. It's oddly soothing, as though the barn itself were breathing. Your mind slips toward comic imagination again. What if villagers truly sang lullabies, complete with rocking motions? Picture a burly farmer cradling a skep as though it were a baby, crooning off-key while bees drowse inside. His neighbors might tease him, but he'd shrug, pointing out that alive bees meant honey, and honey was worth the embarrassment. The monk adjusts another hive, then places sprigs of dried herbs nearby. Thyme, sage, maybe even garlic. Was it for insulation, pest control, or simply tradition? You don't ask. In this twilight world, reasons blur. As you sit in the barn's dimness, you realize this practice wasn't only about survival. It was about trust. Humans carried bees through winter, believing the insects would repay them come spring. The relationship was never equal. Bees didn't know or care about their keepers, but the ritual made it feel reciprocal. The monk lights a small candle, the wax scent mingling with hay. Its glow reflects on the skeps, turning them golden in the shadows. You think back to the chapel, the feasting hall, the marketplace. Each place drew from bees, but here, in the barn, you see the simplest truth. Without wintering, without patience, none of the other sweetness will return. The candle sputters. The monk hums one last note, pats the skep gently, and leaves the bees to their sleep. You follow him out, the chill sharper now, but your heart oddly warm. The barn door creaks shut behind you, and the cold air nips your cheeks as you follow the monk back toward the village. A murmur rises from a nearby tent where a small group of men huddle, their armor dented, their cloaks torn. One soldier holds his arm, blood seeping through linen, while another kneels beside him, opening a pouch. You peer closer and catch a familiar scent. Honey! Mainstream fact. Honey wasn't just food or luxury. It was medicine on battlefields. Medieval healers often smear honey on wounds, using its natural antibacterial qualities to prevent infection. Mixed with herbs or wine, it became a salve applied to cuts, burns, or sores. Soldiers carried jars not for feasting, but for survival. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest knights joked that bees were secret healers, tiny apothecaries buzzing in the fields. You smile at the thought of a weary knight, thanking a swarm after being bandaged with their honey. Imagine a grizzled fighter bowing politely to a skep. Much obliged, little physicians. Historians still argue whether honey was genuinely common on medieval battlefields, or reserved mainly for wealthier armies and monastic infirmaries. Chronicles exaggerate, as always. Some wounds surely festered untreated, but archaeology has revealed jars of honey residue near military camps, lending weight to practice. Debate continues, buzzing faintly like bees themselves. You crouch beside the soldier. His companion dips cloth into a small jar, pressing it against the wound. The honey glistens golden in the firelight, sticky and oddly beautiful even against the torn flesh. The soldier hisses but then exhales, shoulders relaxing as the sting dulls. The monk hums softly nearby, his voice blending with the crackle of the fire. Your modern mind marvels. Without knowing about bacteria, medieval healers stumbled onto an effective antiseptic. You picture nature laughing gently at human ignorance, whispering, "You don't need microscopes. You just need bees." And yet, there's an awkward comedy, too. Honey is sticky, messy, and attracts flies. Imagine a band of soldiers resting after battle, their wounds shining like pastry glaze, swatting insects while grumbling about smelling like desserts. The absurdity doesn't lessen relief, but adds a wry smile to the picture. You watch as the healer ties off the bandage and offers the wounded man a sip of diluted mead for courage. Around them, other soldiers shift uneasily, muttering about omens, swarms, and the buzzing they heard on the march. Bees follow them in stories, as much as in medicine. The monk leans close and whispers that honey also soothed coughs among weary fighters, mixed with wine or herbs to steady their breathing through cold nights. You imagine men huddled in tents, hacking lungs soothed by spoonfuls of sweetness, half medicine, half comfort. One soldier lifts his head and jokes weakly, "If I live, I'll keep a skep myself." The others laugh, their voices rough but genuine. You picture it. Hardened warriors transformed into humming beekeepers, armor traded for straw baskets, swords for smokers. The image warms you, both comic and strangely fitting. The fire pops, the wounded man sighs, and the night settles again. Bees aren't here physically, but their gift coats the battlefield, wrapping pain in gold. You exhale slowly, letting the hum of wings return in your imagination, steady and soothing, as though the hive themselves are singing across the distance. The firelight from the soldiers' camp fades as you drift back towards stone walls and carved archways. The monk leads you through a cloistered passage, and suddenly you're standing before a doorway decorated with strange little creatures. Bees. Not just real ones humming in the meadow, but carved in wood, etched in stone, painted in gilded colors. You step closer and realize bees found their way into medieval art too. Mainstream fact. Throughout the Middle Ages, bees appeared in illuminated manuscripts, stained glass, and church carvings. They symbolized purity, industry, and divine order. Their hexagonal combs fascinated medieval minds, believed to reflect geometry placed by God himself. To monks copying manuscripts, bees represented the quiet diligence they aspired to. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some manuscript margins feature doodles of bees drawn almost like pets, buzzing around knights or monks in miniature cartoons. Imagine a bored scribe slipping a cheeky bee into the corner of a solemn Bible page. Centuries later, you grin at the thought of someone discovering those tiny jokes, a monk's private smile preserved in ink. Historians still argue whether bees in art were mainly theological symbols or whether they sometimes reflected real beekeeping life. A mosaic of bees in one abbey looks almost naturalistic, while others are stylized, with wings more like angel feathers. Were they recording observation, or just layering metaphor on metaphor? Scholars buzz endlessly about it, never quite agreeing. You step inside the church, and light spills through stained glass. One window shows a field, skeps sitting in neat rows, bees flying like golden stars. Another pane shows a saint with bees clustering around his hands, not stinging, but glowing like sparks of holiness. The glass shimmers as sunlight passes through, and for a moment, the air feels alive with colored wings. The monk points at a fresco where bees hover near a chalice, their bodies elongated, wings painted bright. He hums softly, almost reverently, as though art and insects both deserve song. You imagine worshippers staring at these pictures centuries ago, eyes wide, learning their theology through buzzing creatures they saw daily in fields. Then your imagination veers comic again. What if medieval artists simply weren't great at drawing bees? A six-legged blob with wings might have been mistaken for a fly, a dragonfly, or even a tiny angel. Parishioners might have whispered, "Is that a bee?" While priests insisted solemnly, "Yes, and a holy one at that." You lean closer to a carved wooden door. Tiny bees march along its border, each one carefully etched, each wing spread. Your fingers trace the grooves, rough yet deliberate. It feels like an artist loved these creatures enough to grant them permanence, even if their buzzing lives lasted only weeks. The scriptorium comes back to mind, the beeswax smoothing parchment, the quills scratching like wings. Now you see that the bees weren't just tools or metaphors. They were inspirations for beauty. Their hum echoed in sermons, yes, but also in art, caught forever in stone, wood, and glass. The monk hums again, his voice resonating with the still air of the church. The bees in glass seem to shimmer brighter, as though answering him silently. You close your eyes, lulled by the idea that even in art, bees never stop buzzing. They only change medium, wax to glass, hum to line, wing to brushstroke. The church door creaks close behind you, and the monk leads you once more into the open air. A faint breeze carries the smell of smoke, not from incense this time, but from smoldering wood and dried herbs. Ahead, a villager crouches near a cluster of skeps, puffing gently from a clay pot. The smoke billows lazily, curling into the straw domes, and the bees drift more slowly as if dazed. You realize you're witnessing one of the most practical sides of medieval beekeeping. Mainstream fact. Smoke has been used for centuries to calm bees during hive work. Even in medieval times, villagers understood that a puff of smoke made bees less likely to sting, perhaps because it masked alarm pheromones. It allowed keepers to open skeps, collect honeycombs, and inspect colonies without provoking chaos. Though crude compared to modern smokers, clay pots, smoldering herbs, or even torches served the same purpose. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some medieval instructions recommended burning specific herbs, sage, thyme, or cow dung, claiming that certain smokes soothed bees better than others. Imagine a beekeeper experimenting. Too much dung, they're angry, more time. Ah yes, calmer now. The absurdity of trial and error recipes for smoke must have led to both laughter and stings. Historians still argue whether protective clothing was widely used, or if most beekeepers braved the hives with bare hands and minimal veils. Illustrations show both. Peasants standing casually with uncovered faces, and others draped in cloth like awkward ghosts. Perhaps necessity, bravery, or foolishness decided the choice. The record is patchy, buzzing with uncertainty. You crouch closer and notice the villager's outfit. He's wrapped a coarse linen cloth around his head, tied under the chin, with holes poked clumsily for eyes. It looks less like protective gear, and more like a child's costume. You stifle a laugh, but the practicality is clear. Anything between skin and stinger was worth the awkwardness. The monk hums nearby, as though adding sound to smoke. Together, the two elements, song and haze, form a strange duet of control, one calming the human heart, the other clouding bee senses. You watch the beekeeper lift a comb, golden and dripping, wax cells oozing honey. His movements are careful, reverent, as though stealing without offending. Your imagination drifts again. What if protective clothing failed? Picture a medieval man running across a meadow, smoke pot in hand, bees tangled in his hood, singing frantically off-key while villagers watched, half worried, half amused. Comedy was surely never far when stingers were involved. The beekeeper sets the comb gently into a wooden trough, smoke still curling around him. The honey glistens in firelight, thick and slow. Bees buzz around the edges, some landing, others retreating back into the skep. The man whispers something under his breath, half apology, half thanks. You realize that even here, in the most practical act of harvest, ritual lingered. The monk nods approvingly. He knows his rhythm. Hum, smoke, patience. He hums again, low and steady, blending into the smoke's drift. You feel the calm extend to you as well. The buzzing no longer sounds urgent. It sounds like background music, steady and timeless. Your eyes linger on the honeycomb. Its hexagons perfect, geometric, glistening. It's both food and miracle, science and symbol. Humans cloak themselves in cloth, burn herbs, and hum songs, all just to take part in this fragile, sticky exchange. The smoke thins. The beekeeper steps back, and the bees resume their quiet rhythm. The moment feels both comic and profound, a mix of clumsy costumes, smelly smoke, and golden perfection. You exhale, realizing that medieval beekeeping was never just about honey. It was about finding ways, sometimes silly, sometimes ingenious, to negotiate peace with tiny neighbors. The smoke from the beekeeper's clay pot drifts away on the breeze, leaving the meadow in a quiet haze. The monk lifts his head, listening, and you realize he's waiting, not for silence, but for the sound of swarms. When a hive split or grew restless, songs became more than ritual. They were tools to call bees back. Mainstream fact. Throughout medieval Europe, it was common to sing or chant when a swarm left the hive. The belief was that sound, voices, bells, or even banging pots, could lure bees back down. Beekeepers sang slow, rhythmic lines, sometimes religious hymns, sometimes nonsense rhymes, always steady enough to match the drone of wings. Here's the quirky tidbit. In part of England, people even brought out frying pans or church bells to create clamor, believing the vibrations encourage bees to settle. Imagine a village exploding into a kitchen orchestra. Clang, bang, hum, just because a cloud of insects took to the air. What looked chaotic to outsiders was, to villagers, a desperate serenade to bring honey home. Historians still argue whether the sound actually influenced bee behavior or whether it merely gave humans a sense of control. Modern science suggests swarms respond more to pheromones and music, but perhaps the resonance of bells or human voices had subtle effects. Or maybe, as some argue, it calmed keepers themselves, keeping panic at bay. The monk hums now, a slow line that feels less like melody and more like heartbeat. You join, your voice shaky at first, then steadier. Bees circle above, their patterns wide and wandering. You imagine the villagers who once stood in fields, humming together, hoping their voices could stitch bees back into skeps. A memory surfaces, those tales of telling the bees about births, marriages, deaths. Perhaps these swarm songs were part of that tradition, not just commands but conversations, as though humans believed bees needed updates on the family to stay loyal. You chuckle softly at a silly image, a medieval man shouting into the sky, "Come back, bees! I'll sing better this time." His neighbors roll their eyes, but he keeps chanting, convinced his buzzing chorus will do the trick. The swarm above dips lower, clustering in the air, as though listening. The monk raises his pitch slightly, then lets it fall, like a lullaby sliding toward sleep. The bees drift closer, wings glinting in sunlight. For a moment, you feel the strange tension. Are they responding, or is it all coincidence? The answer doesn't matter. The hum in your chest feels as steady as theirs. You realize the songs were never just about bees. They were about hope, about humans trying to harmonize with creatures they couldn't control. The melody filled the air with trust, reminding everyone that nature might be persuaded, if not commanded. The swarm finally settles on a branch, wings shimmering. The monk lowers his voice, lets it fade into silence. You're left with the soft drone of bees, the rustle of leaves, and the odd comfort of knowing that sound, whether effective or not, always made the work feel less lonely. The branch sags under the weight of the bees, but soon the swarm calms, slipping quietly into the skep the villagers prepared. The tension dissolves, and laughter ripples through the square. The monk smiles faintly, but his gaze shifts toward the village green, where music and voices already rise. Tonight, bees have given more than honey. They've given an excuse for celebration. Mainstream fact: mead, the fermented drink made from honey, was a cornerstone of medieval celebrations across Europe. Villagers brewed it for weddings, fairs, and seasonal feasts. Sweet, heady, and faintly sparkling, mead carried the flavor of the hive into mugs raised high in song and laughter. In cultures from Scandinavia to Saxony, it was considered the drink of joy, sometimes even the gods. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some places, newlyweds were encouraged to drink mead daily for the first month of marriage, hence the term honeymoon. You grin, imagining couples dutifully sipping honey wine, while elders wink knowingly, convinced the bees themselves were blessing the union. Historians still argue whether mead was a dominant drink across medieval Europe, or if ale and wine overshadowed it in many regions. Some claim he declined as sugar imports rose, while others insist it remained strong in northern and rural traditions. The debate buzzes like a tavern chorus, unresolved but lively. You wander the green where villagers already sway, mugs sloshing golden liquid. A fiddler scrapes out a lively tune while children chase one another, sticky fingers still glistening from stolen honeycomb. A woman offers you a wooden cup. You sip, and the mead tingles on your tongue, sweet but sharp, warming your throat. The monk stands at the edge, humming in rhythm with the fiddler. Bees hum too, though fainter now, drawn to blossoms edging the square. For once, their buzzing blends with human music, indistinguishable from laughter and clapping. And then the comic image strikes. A man too deep into his cup insists he can sing the bees back home. He staggers across the grass, humming loudly, his mug sloshing dangerously. His friends cheer, though the bees ignore him completely. You chuckle. Mead was a drink of joy, but also made fools brave enough to serenade insects. The music quickens. Villagers dance in circles, skirts swirling, boots stomping. Mead splashes on the ground, feeding grass that will someday bloom into flowers for bees again. The cycle feels almost poetic. Bees make honey. Honey makes mead. Mead fuels dancing, and the dancing feet stir soil for flowers to return. A child tugs your cloak, offering a honey cake baked for the feast. It's dense, spiced with cinnamon, sweet enough to make your teeth ache. You bite, and for a moment, your senses blur. Honey, music, laughter, the hum of bees. It's a communion of sweetness and sound, a ritual joy as sacred as any chapel hymn. The monk hums louder, swaying gently, his voice merging with fiddles and buzzing wings. You sip again, warm and drowsy, and realize bees weren't just healers or workers. They were entertainers too, their golden labor distilled into drink and dance, turning hard days into celebration. The night deepens, stars prickling overhead. The bees quiet in their skeps, villagers stumble home, and the hum remains steady, eternal, like an unseen melody woven into the earth. The village green empties slowly, mead mugs abandoned on benches, fiddle stilt, and bees slipping back into their skeps. The monk gestures for you to follow him once again, this time toward a smaller stone building near the market. Inside, the air is thick with voices, calm, serious, tinged with rivalry. A group of men stand around a table, parchment spread before them, tallying hives and debating rights. You realize you've stepped into the world of guilds. Mainstream fact. By the later Middle Ages, beekeepers in some towns and regions formed associations, or guilds, much like butchers, bakers, or weavers. These guilds regulated trade, set prices for honey and wax, and settled disputes. They ensured that markets didn't flood with cheap or adulterated honey, and that each keeper's rights were recognized. Bees, once wild and free, were now woven into the fabric of regulated commerce. Here's the quirky tidbit. Guild statutes sometimes included odd rules, like requiring members to swear not to steal swarms from neighbors or forbidding them to sell honey mixed with flour to stretch the weight. Imagine a solemn oath-taking ceremony where men raised their hands and vowed, "I shall not water down honey nor pinch my neighbor's bees." It sounds almost comedic, but livelihoods depended on those promises. Historians still argue whether these guilds were widespread or limited to wealthy urban centers. Evidence of formal statutes survives in German and French cities, but rural areas likely relied on customary law and community judgment. The debate hums along like bees in separate hives. Some scholars convince guilds dominated, others insisting most villagers never saw such organization. You step closer to the table, listening. One man slams his palm down, accusing another of poaching bees when a swarm crosses orchard. Another waves a parchment, citing the right to sell wax in the town square. Their voices rise and fall, serious yet faintly absurd. You're listening to arguments about insects who care nothing for human borders. The monk hums faintly at your side, and you can't help but imagine him humming louder just to drown out the bickering. You almost laugh. Perhaps bees themselves were calmer than the men who claimed to keep them. A parchment catches your eye. It lists fines. So many pennies for stealing honey, so many more for damaging skeps, and a larger fee still for disguising your honey as someone else's at market. You grin at the thought of counterfeit honey in the Middle Ages. Jars with fake labels, medieval marketing fraud. Then your imagination wanders into full comedy. Picture a medieval courtroom where two men bring in buzzing skeps as evidence, bees escaping and terrorizing the judge while the clerk desperately scribbles. Case unresolved due to swarm. And yet, beneath the absurdity, you sense the importance. Bees weren't trivial. They were money like food and medicine. Of course people fought. Of course they regulated. Of course they swore solemn oaths over swarms. The monk hums again, softer now, as the guildsmen shuffle their parchments and finally nod in agreement. A price is set, a fine is paid, and the disputes buzz into silence. Outside, the bees hum in their skeps, oblivious of bureaucracy they've inspired. You smile at the irony. Tiny creatures more orderly than the humans who try to imitate them. You step out into the night air, the stars glowing faintly. Behind you, the guild hall murmurs with the sound of human negotiations. Ahead, the meadow hums with bees who need no contracts, no oaths, no parchment. Just wings, wax, and rhythm. The guild hall fades behind you, its parchments and arguments left in shadow, and the monk leads you into a quieter lane. Lanterns flicker against stone walls, and ahead you notice a cottage with its door ajar. Inside, the air is warm and thick with the scent of herbs hanging from rafters. A woman stirs a clay pot by the fire, muttering softly to herself. She is no monk, no guildsman. She is a village healer. Mainstream fact, beeswax and honey were essential in medieval household medicine. Honey was mixed into syrups for coughs, poultices for wounds, and ointments for sore throats. Beeswax thickened balms, turning herbs and oils into salves that could be spread on skin. For many households, bees provided both food and pharmacy. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some folk recipes instructed healers to melt wax while reciting specific prayers or rhymes, believing the words bound healing power into the ointment. Imagine muttering half a psalm while stirring bubbling wax, peeking over your shoulder to be sure no one laughed at your secret recipe. You smile at the mix of faith and folklore bubbling in every pot. Historians still argue whether these remedies were genuinely effective or mostly placebo. Honey's antiseptic properties are undeniable, but waxy salves may have been more symbolic than scientific. Yet records of healed wounds and soothed coughs suggest that at least some of the bees' gifts were more than wishful thinking. The debate hums quietly in medical history, unresolved but fascinating. You crouch near the hearth, watching the healer pour melted wax into a bowl of crushed herbs and goose fat. She stirs, murmuring steadily, until the mixture thickens into a greenish balm. She scoops a bit on the cloth, wraps it, and presses it gently to a boy's scraped knee. The child winces, then relaxes, the honey sweetness already working its quiet magic. The monk hums approvingly, though his chant is softer now, respectful of the woman's role. You realize the harmony of the hive extended beyond monks and guilds. Women, often overlooked in records, carried bees into the heart of homes. Your imagination tips toward comedy again. Picture a child licking the honey balm off his wound when no one's watching, earning a scolding from his mother and another application of sticky medicine. Healing, interrupted by sweet temptation. The healer turns toward jars on a shelf. Honey infused with garlic for coughs, wax candles marked with crosses for sickbeds, a pot of meat intended more for easing pain than for celebration. Each item glows faintly in firelight, as if bees had left their golden fingerprint behind. You glance at the herbs overhead. Sage, rosemary, lavender, all entwined with beeswax in her recipes. It feels like a hidden alchemy, ordinary ingredients transformed by the hive into remedies that kept families alive. The child yawns, the balm doing its work, and the healer whispers a rhyme of thanks. The monk joins, humming, not to guide bees this time, but to bless human rest. You close your eyes, lulled by warmed herbs and hums, and realize bees were not only healers of wounds, but healers of households. Their gifts folded into every pot, every whispered charm, every act of care. The healer's cottage fades behind you, the smell of herbs lingering in your cloak. The monk leads you onward, toward a larger stone house at the edge of the village. Inside, you find shelves stacked with scrolls, maps, and books, far more than a humble scriptorium. This is not a monk's library, but the study of a lord's steward, where bees are counted not for honey or medicine, but for taxes. Mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, bees and their products were often subject to taxation. Lords demanded honey as par rent, and wax was especially prized for lighting churches and halls. Some tenants paid in skeps of honey instead of coin. Record from manorial rolls lists precise obligations. So many pounds of wax at Michaelmas, so many jars of honey at Easter. Bees buzzed even in the ledgers of medieval accountants. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some places, a fine for misbehavior could be paid in honey. Imagine being caught trespassing and having to hand over 2 jars of golden sweetness instead of silver coins. You grin at the thought of the peasant sighing, "There goes my winter honey," while the reeve happily licked his spoon. Historians still argue whether honey was truly a staple taxation everywhere, or whether such records were exceptions limited to regions without easy access to sugar or wine. Some rolls show heavy honey obligations, while others barely mention bees. The debate leaves historians buzzing with uncertainty, each roll like a half-filled comb. You step closer to the steward's table. He scratches with quill, tallying skeps owed by each villager. Beside him sits a sealed jar, evidence of today's payment. You lean in. Thick honey, golden as sunlight, traded not for celebration, but as tribute. The monk hums softly, but here it sounds more like a sigh, song subdued by the weight of obligation. You imagine the awkward humor of it all, a villager trudging into the hall, muttering, "Here's my rent," plopping down a sticky jar, only for the steward to grumble when honey dripped across parchment records. The mix of solemn duty and inevitable mess feels deeply human. The steward looks up and gestures to parchment rolls stacked high. Each line names a tenant. Each note of payment, another thread tying bees to power. It strikes you that bees didn't just feed or heal, they fuel politics, too. Wax-lit cathedrals, honey-sweetened nobles' tables, and taxes swelled lords' coffers. All thanks to insects humming in straw baskets. The monk whispers that in some places, peasants rebelled against excessive honey taxes. He hums a memory as though it were another chant, reminding you that even sweetness could turn sour when demanded too heavily. You glance at the jar again. It gleams beautifully, but here its glow feels colder. Not a feast, not a cure, not a charm, just rent. Yet even so, the bee's work carried value strong enough to rival coin. The steward dips his quill, hums distractedly, and marks another entry. The monk leads you out, the sound of scratching pens fading into hum of bees outside. You sigh, half amused, half thoughtful. Even in the realm of taxes, the bees had their say. The steward's study fades into silence as a monk leads you down a road toward the edge of the village, where the forest presses close. The path narrows, shaded by oak and ash, and here you notice something different. Not straw skeps, not orderly gardens, but hollow tree trunks, carefully tended. A man in rough clothes climbs a ladder, reaching into a cavity in the bark. You realize you're seeing the older practice, forest beekeeping. Mainstream fact. Before skeps spread widely, many medieval beekeepers relied on tree hives, hollowed logs, or natural cavities where bees nested. In parts of Eastern Europe and Germany, this tradition endured well into the Middle Ages. Keepers climbed trees, cut small doors, and harvested honey directly from the hollows, often leaving offerings to ensure the bees stayed. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some forest beekeepers marked their trees with personal symbols, almost like branding livestock. A carved cross, initials, or a simple figure declared, "These bees are mine." Imagine wandering through a dense wood and stumbling on trees etched with dozens of little signs, a secret graffiti gallery of medieval beekeepers. Historians still argue whether forest beekeeping was primarily commercial or domestic. Some records describe villages supplying lords with wax from woodland hives, while folklore suggests families guard a few treasured trees as private wealth. Perhaps it was both, communal and personal, practical and mystical. The debate still climbs those trees like the keepers once did. You tilt your head back, watching the man reach carefully into the hollow, smoke pot dangling from his belt. Bees drift lazily around him, and he hums, low and steady, as though singing into the tree. His voice seems swallowed by bark, blending with the hum inside. You wonder how many generations climbed these same trunks, whispering the same songs. The monk murmurs that some believe forest hives held wild, purer bees, closer to paradise than those kept in skeps. A faint smile crosses his lips, as though he, too, feels the difference between meadow and forest hum. You imagine a comic misstep. A beekeeper climbing too high, bees pouring out, his hum turning to a shriek as he scrambled down, landing in a heap while neighbors laughed. Surely not every harvest ended gracefully. And yet, there's reverence here. The carved marks on the trees, the careful smoke, the hums. Each gesture feels like negotiation, a respectful bargain between human and hive. The forest itself seems to breathe with it, branches creaking in rhythm with buzzing. You reach out to touch one carved symbol, a rough spiral, half worn by weather. It feels like a secret handshake across centuries, one beekeeper telling another, "This tree is spoken for, these bees are under song." The man descends, holding a chunk of comb glistening with honey. He bows slightly to the tree, habit, superstition, or gratitude, and wraps the comb in cloth. The monk hums approval, and you follow the sound back along the path. The forest grows darker, but the hum stays steady, as if trees themselves have learned to sing. The forest path opens again, and the monk guides you to a clearing where children chase one another between low wooden stalls. Merchants call out, their tables stacked with jars of golden liquid, blocks of wax, and candles tied neatly with string. You've stumbled into a market day, and hear the bees hum not in meadows but in commerce. Mainstream fact. Honey and beeswax were valuable trade goods in medieval markets. Honey sweetened food and drink, while wax lit churches and homes. In many towns, wax was more precious than honey, driving trade networks across Europe. Ports shipped wax from the Baltic southward, while local fairs thrived on jars of golden honey sold to villagers who couldn't keep bees themselves. Here's the quirky tidbit. Merchants sometimes flavor honey with herbs, nuts, or even pepper to fetch higher prices. Imagine a buyer cautiously sniffing a jar. Rosemary honey, guaranteed to cure melancholy. while neighbors roll their eyes at the sales pitch. Medieval marketing, it seems, was just as inventive as today's. Historians still argue whether beekeeping supplied mainly local markets or whether large-scale trade dominated. Some chronicles describe carts full of wax bound for cathedrals, while others emphasize small village exchanges. The truth probably buzzed somewhere in between, with both humble stalls and grand shipments shaping the trade. You pause at one stall where a merchant cuts slices of honeycomb, offering taste to curious children. Their faces light up, mouths sticky, hands held out for more. Behind him, candles stand like soldiers, their wax glistening in the sun. Each one represents hundreds of bees' labor, melted and molded into tidy order for sale. A woman haggles over price, muttering that last week's honey tasted watered down. The merchant protests loudly, swearing by saints and bees alike that his product is purer. You grin, remembering the guild fines for mixing flour into honey. It seems temptation to cheat was universal. Your imagination spins into comedy. Picture a medieval version of a food critic, solemnly tasting honey at market, smacking lips, then declaring, undertones of clover, a hint of dung smoke, 2 stars out of 5. Villagers would likely just shrug and buy the cheapest jar anyway. The monk hums softly, his voice threading through the clamor. You realize that even here, surrounded by barter and coins, the rhythm of bees persists. Every jar, every candle, every comb carried a hum of hives into the marketplace. You watch a child hold up a candle to the sun, marveling at its glow. For her, it's just light. For her mother, it's hours of labor saved from spinning rushes. For the church, it's sacred illumination. For the bees, it was simply wax, now melted and sold. Each perspective layers atop the other, forming a complex hive of meaning around a single product. As the market swells, voices rise, coins clink, and bees hover lazily above spilled honey. You breathe it all in, sweetness, noise, rhythm, and realize medieval markets were just another extension of the hive. Busy, loud, full of bargains and quarrels, but ultimately sustained by tiny wings. The market stalls fade behind you as the monk guides you to a quieter lane where stone walls rise higher, banners hang heavier, and armored guards lean on their spears. You've stepped into the orbit of nobles now, where bees aren't just food or medicine, they're symbols of power. Mainstream fact. In medieval heraldry, bees often appeared on coats of arms, seals, and banners. They symbolize industry, loyalty, and divine order. Nobles who wished to be seen as diligent and harmonious chose bees as emblems, hoping their rule would seem as natural and orderly as a hive. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some cases, nobles even issued decrees protecting their bees with harsher penalties than those protecting peasants. Imagine stealing a hive and facing a stiffer punishment than if you'd insulted the Lord Steward. You smirk at the absurd hierarchy, bees buzzing just above commoners in the order of legal importance. Historians still argue whether the symbolism of bees and noble imagery was genuine admiration or simply borrowed prestige from classical sources. Romans had long praised bees as models of order, and medieval lords may have copied the association more than lived it. Were they truly inspired by hives, or just eager to borrow their reputation? The debate hums on. You gaze at a carved shield hanging above the castle gate. 6 bees arranged in a circle, wings spread wide. The guard yawns below it, clearly less inspired than his master by the emblem. You imagine the noble himself in court, boasting of his bee-like diligence, while peasants whisper that he was more drone than worker. Inside the hall, tapestries hang heavy, some embroidered with bees buzzing among flowers, others with hives standing like fortresses. Candles line the walls, their wax the very reason bees became symbols of wealth. The noble strides in, robes sweeping, his chest embroidered with golden bees. He nods at you briefly as though sharing their glow. The monk hums faintly beside you, but here his voice seems swallowed by pomp. You almost laugh at the thought of bees, humble meadow dwellers, pressed into such stiff symbolism. Still, the imagery carries weight. To the noble, bees stand for harmony under hierarchy, a justification for power itself. Your imagination plays again. What if the noble's bees refused the symbolism, swarming instead into his feast hall, covering his golden embroidery until he resembled a walking hive? The dignity of heraldry undone by buzzing reality. The noble raises a goblet, toasts to the order of the hive, and the hall echoes his words dutifully. But as you glance at the candles burning in silver holders, you remember the barns, the cottages, the swarms and oak trees. For peasants, bees were survival. For nobles, they were spectacle. Still, both realms depended on the same wings. Bees, indifferent to symbols or taxes, kept flying, kept building, kept humming. Whether etched into shields or whispered to in barns, they held a power no lord could fully command. You exhale, amused and sobered at once. Even here, amid gold and banners, the hum remained steady, softer than trumpets, truer than heraldry, eternal as wings. The noble hall fade from your senses, the embroidered bees gleaming faintly in memory, as the monk leads you to yet another threshold. The great cathedral at the center of town. Its spires claw at the sky, bells toll slowly, and when you step inside, you're wrapped in the glow of countless candles. The air smells of incense and warm wax, heavy and holy. Here, bees offered not feasts or taxes, but light itself. Mainstream fact. Medieval churches consumed enormous quantities of beeswax. Unlike smoky tallow, wax burned clean and bright, making it the only acceptable candle for liturgy. Cathedrals demanded tons each year, drawing from peasant hives, monastic apiaries, and long-distance trade. Without bees, the vaulted spaces of Europe's faith would have remained shadowed and dim. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some records show wax candles carved into elaborate shapes, spirals, wheels, or even towering constructions taller than a man. These show candles burned during major feasts, sometimes taking days to melt. You grin, picturing a priest anxiously watching as wax dripped onto stone, muttering prayers at the expense of spectacle wouldn't topple mid-service. Historians still argue whether cathedrals drained local villages dry of wax, or whether large monastic estates kept hives sufficient to supply their needs. Some rolls suggest crushing burdens on peasants, while others show smooth streams of wax delivered from abbeys. The truth likely varied, leaving scholars buzzing at the edges of incomplete records. You step deeper, and the glow overwhelms. Rows upon rows of tall candles flicker, their flames reflecting on marble floors, gilded statues, and painted ceilings. The monk's hum merges with chant from a choir, and for a moment you feel the bee's labor has been transformed into pure light. You run your fingers along a candle's base. The wax is warm, soft, faintly scented of honey even here in holy space. You imagine the journey. Meadow to skep to trough to taper to altar. Every flame whispers of fields, wings, and songs. Then your imagination slips into comedy again. What if you survived the candle-making process, trapped in wax, only to awaken in church, buzzing angrily around a bishop's head mid-sermon? The solemnity broken by frantic swats as the congregation giggle behind their hands. Still, reverence dominates here. Candles line the altar like an army of golden sentinels, their flames swaying in invisible breezes. Each one is a prayer, a plea, a reminder of divine presence. For worshippers, the glow was miraculous. For bees, it was just stored sunlight, harvested without their consent. The monk bows his head, humming softer, his voice blending with Latin chants. You close your eyes, feeling the hum shift from meadow song to cathedral drone, as though the bees themselves had joined the choir centuries ago. Light flickers across your eyelids, steady, endless. You breathe slowly, soothed by warmth and glow, by the strange thought that perhaps the holiest sound in cathedral wasn't the organ or the choir, but the hum of bees embedded in every flame. The cathedral's glow lingers in your eyes as you step outside, the night cooler, quieter. The monk doesn't lead you back toward meadows or skeps this time. Instead, he guides you through winding alleys to a cramped stone house where parchments pile high and quills lie scattered. Inside sits a scholar, his face shadowed by lamplight, scratching away at a thick manuscript. You realize you're peering into the world of medieval science, where even bees became subject to curiosity and debate. Mainstream fact. Scholars of the Middle Ages inherited ancient texts from Aristotle, Pliny, and later Islamic writers, all fascinated by bees. They puzzled over hive hierarchy, reproduction, and flight. Most repeated Aristotle's claim that bees had a king, not a queen, and debated endlessly whether bees reproduce sexually or simply appear through mysterious processes. To them, bees were as much philosophical puzzles as agricultural creatures. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some scholars earnestly argue that bees were born from ox carcasses, citing the ancient belief in begonia. Imagine professors solemnly declaring, "Yes, kill a cow, and from its rotting body, bees will arise." You chuckle, picturing skeptical students side-eyeing their master, wondering if he'd ever actually tried it. Historians still argue whether medieval scholars truly believed such claims, or whether they repeated them as rhetorical flourishes. Some manuscripts hint at skepticism, while others cling to tradition with remarkable stubbornness. The debate swirls like bees in a drafty chamber, unresolved but buzzing with fascination. You glance at the scholar's parchment. Tiny bee sketches march across the margins, wings stiff, bodies round. His Latin notes describe comb geometry, hive order, honey purity. He dips his quill again, pauses, and mutters to himself about whether bees have lungs. The monk hums in the background, as though providing a soundtrack to speculation. Your imagination strays into comedy. What if a swarm flew straight into the scholar's study mid-lecture, covering his books and quills? He'd scramble to swat them with Aristotle's manuscript, while shouting, "At last, empirical evidence!" The scholar frowns, scratching out a line. He writes a new one, Apis regis, be king. You resist the urge to lean over and whisper, "Actually, it's a queen." But you let him continue. Truth will arrive centuries later, buzzing through microscopes and experiments. For now, the error itself is part of the charm. You notice on his desk a small wax tablet, its surface etched with calculations. He runs a finger across a neat hexagon, muttering about geometry. Even in error, there is brilliance, recognition that bees embody a strange, divine order. The monk's hum deepens, steady as a heartbeat. The scholar hardly notices, lost in thought. But you feel the hum filling the study, reminding you that theories and errors alike were always accompanied by the same eternal sound of wings. You lean against the wall, amused and soothed at once. Bees, in their silence, outlived every debate, every mistaken parchment. Their truth buzzed on while humans scribbled furiously in the dark. The scholar's study fades into shadows as the monk ushers you outside once more. The streets are quieter now, lamps flickering, but he doesn't stop. Instead, he leads you beyond the walls, toward a wide meadow bathed in moonlight. At its center, villagers gather with baskets, jars, and cloths, murmuring softly. A priest lifts his hands, sprinkling water over skeps. You realize this is no market, no tax collection, but a ritual, telling the bees. Mainstream fact. Across parts of medieval Europe, it was customary to inform bees of major family events, births, marriages, and deaths. The belief held that if bees weren't told, they might sicken, stop producing honey, or even abandon the hive. So keepers whispered news directly to the skeps, treating bees as part of the household, witnesses to life's passages. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some customs required draping skeps in black cloth during funerals, so the bees could mourn with the family. Imagine a line of buzzing baskets dressed like tiny widows, solemn and absurd all at once. You can't help but grin, picturing bees politely buzzing in funeral attire. Historians still argue whether this tradition was widespread in the Middle Ages, or whether it became more prominent in later folklore. References appear in scattered chronicles, but much evidence comes from oral traditions collected centuries afterward. The debate itself is like a swarm, sometimes clear, sometimes drifting out of reach. You watch as the priest leans toward a hive, murmuring Latin prayers. A villager follows, whispering about a birth in his family, voice shaking with pride. Another bows, announcing a recent death. The monk hums quietly beside you, his tone reverent, blending with prayers and buzzing. You picture the comedy of a child tasked with telling the bees, standing nervously by a skep and blurting, Father says Uncle's gone, before sprinting away in case the bees took offense. Perhaps the ritual was less solemn in practice than records suggest. Yet here, under moonlight, it feels solemn indeed. Each whisper binds humans and hives closer, as though acknowledging that bees weren't just livestock but companions, woven into every joy and sorrow. The draped skeps look uncanny, their claws shifting in the breeze like figures bowing their heads. You close your eyes and listen. The hum of bees is steady, as if they receive the news quietly, without judgment. Life, death, marriage, birth. It all passes through their buzzing, the constant background of village existence. The monk hums lower still, soft in the priest's chant, softer even in the buzzing. You feel the ritual wrap around you, a reminder that for medieval folk, bees weren't only workers or metaphors. They were part of the household choir, witnesses to life's fragile cycle. The meadow empties slowly, villagers drifting home with lanterns in hand, leaving the draped skeps behind in moonlight. You follow the monk along a dirt path until you reach a wooden gate. Beyond it lies a graveyard, stones crooked and mossy, with candles flickering faintly in the night. Here, the bee's presence lingers not in song or honey, but in memory. Mainstream fact. Medieval folk often linked bees with the soul, believing their flight symbolized a passage from life to death. Some sermons spoke of bees rising like spirits toward heaven, while wax from hives lit vigils beside the dying. Bees hovered not only in meadows, but in imaginations of the afterlife. Here's the quirky tidbit. In certain tales, if bees were not informed of their keeper's death, they were believed to swarm away or even die themselves in mourning. Imagine the panic of grieving families rushing out mid-funeral to whisper the news into skeps. Don't worry, we'll still feed you. You smirk at the image, grief colliding with frantic insect etiquette. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were genuine theology or local superstition tolerated by clergy. Some monks wrote sternly against foolish tales of bees, while others embraced them as harmless traditions. The line between faith and folklore blurs, humming like wings in twilight. You kneel near a gravestone, where a candle burns low, its wax pooling across moss. You imagine the countless bees whose wax have been melted into sacred light, guiding prayers for the dead. Every flame here is a memory of wings, of hives, of buzzing fields long past. The monk hums quietly, his tone almost mournful now, carrying into the night. You picture the souls of villagers drifting like bees from hive to sky, leaving behind honeyed traces in memory. And then a comic image intrudes. What if spirits rode bees upward, clinging to wings, wobbling toward heaven in swarms of glowing souls? A solemn priest might frown at such a thought, but you chuckle softly, unable to resist the picture of ghostly riders buzzing skyward. Still, the moment holds weight. You trace the carved cross on a stone, notice a sprig of rosemary left at its base, and realize the same herbs used to calm bees were placed here to honor the dead. Life and death intertwined, both bound by song, smoke, and sweetness. The monk's hum fades to silence. Only the bees remain in your ears, though none fly in the night air. You rise, stepping carefully between stones, feeling that even in graveyards, bees had their place, buzzing in metaphors of life, loss, and light. The graveyard slips behind you, shadows stretching long, and the monk guides you toward a hilltop where the wind whistles low through grass. From here, you see the whole village spread beneath the stars, skeps by cottages, wax candles glowing in windows, faint humming drifting even at this distance. The monk pauses, then gestures higher still. You climb, breath slow, until you reach a small stone tower. Inside, parchment scattered across a table. A traveler, ink-stained and weary, writes by lamplight. He is not a monk or steward. He is a poet. Mainstream fact. Medieval poets and writers often turned to bees as metaphors for human creativity. They compared words to honey, verses to combs, and poets themselves to beekeepers collecting sweetness from nature. From Virgil's Georgics to later troubadours, bees buzz into literature as symbols of inspiration. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some poems even describe bees as tiny musicians, their hum imagined as music echoing in harmony with human songs. Picture a medieval bard insisting, "My choir has wings," while strumming a lute. You grin at the thought of someone trying to sell tickets to a bee concert. Historians still argue whether medieval poets drew on real observation of bees or leaned entirely on classical inheritance. Do they actually sit by hives listening, or simply borrow Virgil's honey metaphors? The debate hums across anthologies, half nature, half nostalgia. You glance at the poet's parchment. He writes, "My verses, sweet as honey, gather from field of thought." He pauses, dips his quill, and mutters about rhythm. The monk hums softly behind you, and you realize the hum itself could pass for meter, a steady cadence guiding the poet's hand. The lamp flickers, shadows dancing across the wall. You imagine the comic side. What if bees flew straight into the poet's inkpot, leaving sticky footprints across his page? He'd frown, sigh, and then probably turn it into a metaphor. Even my bees right. The poet looks up, tired but bright-eyed, as if his words taste sweeter with each line. You picture medieval listeners nodding along, savoring lines about honey and combs, perhaps not realizing how deeply bees had seeped into their culture. The monk hums lower now, his sound more like a lullaby than chant. The poet scratches one final line and sets his quill aside. Outside, bees hum faintly in the night, blending with the wind. You sit in the tower's quiet, soothed by the realization that poetry, like honey, was both labor and sweetness, harvested patiently, shared generously, enduring far beyond the hum of wings. The poet's tower grows dim behind you as the monk leads you down the hill once more. Dawn is close now, the air cool and silver, and a faint buzzing drifts from a meadow ahead. But this time, it isn't a single hive, it's dozens. You arrived at an apiary larger than any you've seen, rows of skeps stretching into the mist, a buzzing city unto itself. Mainstream fact. Medieval monasteries and noble estates often maintain vast apiaries, sometimes hundreds of skeps strong. These were industrial-scale operations by the standards of the age, producing wax for cathedrals, honey for markets, and mead for feasts. Records describe abbeys boasting of their bees, as they did vineyards and mills, each hive another engine of wealth. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some estates supposedly employed bee wardens whose entire duty was to guard hives against theft or mischief. Imagine a man patrolling fields at night, lanterns swinging, muttering, "Not tonight, honey thieves," while bees doze quietly in their straw domes. You smirk at the thought, security guards for insects. Historians still argue whether these large operations were common or exceptional. Some evidence suggests monasteries cornered the wax trade, while other scholars argue that local peasants still provided the bulk. The truth, as ever, buzzes somewhere between parchment records and folk memory. You walk slowly between rows of skeps. The hum here is immense, layered and resonant, like a choir of wings. Each hive is draped with care, cloths against rain, herbs against pests, carvings of crosses or initials. Monks move among them, humming softly, tending, checking, lifting combs. The rhythm feels rehearsed, as though every beekeeper were part of one great chorus. The monk at your side joins in, his hum blending with theirs. You imagine this place not just as work, but as music, a meadow turned into an orchestra pit. Each skep a different instrument, the air itself vibrating with sound. Your thoughts stray toward comedy. What if one monk hummed off-key, sour enough to confuse the bees? You picture them swirling in irritated loops, forcing the poor monk to endure teasing from his brothers. Brother Thomas, the bees prefer harmony. Still, reverence outweighs humor. The scale of it all overwhelms you. Every candle in cathedrals, every jar in markets, every bomb in cottages might trace back here. The fields alive with wings. These apiaries were not just farms. They were factories of light and sweetness, maintained by patience, prayer, and song. A bell tolls faintly from the monastery, calling the monks to prayer. They leave their hives slowly, humming as they go, leaving the bees to their endless work. The hum doesn't fade. It remains, steady, filling the dawn air like an unbroken hymn. You pause, breathing in the mist, hearing the vast living choir. In this moment, the medieval world feels less like stone and parchment, more like wax and wing. The apiary is a city, its citizens tireless, its music eternal. You close your eyes, letting the sound carry you, steady as a heartbeat, soft as a lullaby. The mist over the apiary curls like smoke as the sun's edge peaks above the horizon. You and the monk stand still, listening to the great hum of hundreds of skeps. The sound is neither loud nor harsh. It is steady, soft, endless, a reminder that life continues, wing beat by wing beat. For one last time, the monk hums along, his voice blending so naturally that you can't tell where sound ends and the bees begins. Mainstream fact. Many medieval chronicles ended their descriptions of bees with reflections on order, patience, and the strange harmony of nature. Bees embodied lessons for farmers, monks, and nobles alike. That small things build great hives, that labor shared as labor eased, and that sweetness can be drawn even from toil. Here's the quirky tidbit. One writer claimed bees hated quarrels. Fly away if humans shouted too loudly near their hives. Imagine villagers arguing in the meadow, only to stop abruptly as bees poured out, scolding them with stings. You can't help but laugh softly, bees as tiny referees enforcing peace. Historians still argue whether such anecdotes reveal real observation or moral storytelling. Perhaps bees really were sensitive to human noise. Perhaps writers just enjoyed imagining insects as arbiters of virtue. Either way, the stories linger like wings in morning light. You close your eyes, feeling the meadow's hum sink into your chest. From a first song sung to skeps, to honeyed feasts, to wax candles burning in cathedrals, to whispered charms and solemn guild odes, bees have carried you across the medieval world. Everywhere, their wings beat behind the scenes, turning labor into sweetness, darkness into light. Your imagination plays once more. What if bees could sing back? What if, after centuries of monks humming to them, they finally answered, their drone shaping into words? Perhaps they would simply say, "Keep humming, human. We like the company." The monk falls silent now, leaving only the bees. Their sound is steady, soothing, as though the entire meadow breathes. And now, as you linger in this meadow, it is time to let the hum fade into your own breathing. The sound of wings slows, softer, gentler, as if each bee tucks itself into its comb for rest. The monk has gone quiet, his song dissolved into the air, leaving you with stillness that is not empty but calm, like a candle burning low. Let your shoulders ease, your chest loosen. Imagine the skeps around you as small houses asleep, each one filled with tiny lives resting, safe and warm. The hum is no longer a song but a whisper, a steady vibration that matches your heartbeat. With each breath, the world grows simpler. Straw, wax, wing, and silence. The meadow stretches into dusk. Even though dawn had just broken, time itself slows, folds, and drifts like smoke. You see the bees only as golden flickers now, sparks dissolving into the horizon. The monk's footsteps fade entirely. You are left alone, but not lonely, accompanied by thousands of tiny guardians who have sung you into stillness. You may picture yourself lying down in the tall grass, the earth beneath cool and steady, the sky above wide and tender. The hum around you becomes softer still, then distant, then almost imagined. It lingers only enough to remind you that rhythm exists everywhere. Bees and skeps, breath and lungs, dreams and minds. Allow the last of that rhythm to guide you gently into rest. Let the meadow dissolve into your own quiet. The bees have sung their songs. The candles have burned. The honey has been shared. And now, only peace remains. Sleep, steady as wings. Sleep, sweet as honey. Sleep, endless as a hum.